Hi everyone, this is Matt Wade, Microsoft MVP and overall guru with Microsoft Teams. The last few weeks we've seen a huge surge in the adoption and usage of Microsoft Teams for chat, collaboration, meetings, calling, all of those features, as a lot of organizations worldwide have been asking their employees to work from home. This might be the first time ever that a lot of these organizations, whether it's a company, government, educational institution, has ever asked people to actually do all of this work from home, whether they're going to through distance learning or they're working with their colleagues from their laptops at home. This is a real first. So what we're going to talk about today is a number of different best practices, tips, tricks, etiquette, the everyday kind of stuff that can make your experience using Microsoft Teams with all the people that you work or learn with a much better experience. So let's get going. So we've seen a real surge in the use of tools like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Slack, and other collaboration, meeting, and chat apps over the last few weeks because of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic worldwide. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how you want to make the best use of Microsoft Teams and what are some of the best practices, tips and tricks, and essentially etiquette to make sure that you're having the best experience with yourself, your colleagues, everybody else you're going to be working with. This video actually has different sections for each portion of Microsoft Teams that you might be interested in, so feel free to look below. I have links to each of the sections so you can kind of jump to it as you need to. There'll be a little bit of background with each one as necessary, but just so you have a little bit of background on the overall aspect of sort of online communications. We have lived in basically an email world, or at least an online messaging turned email world for about the last half century. And it wasn't until 2016 that Microsoft Teams came around, essentially as a result of the success of Slack, which was launched in about 2013. Now, Microsoft has acknowledged about 20 million daily active users of Microsoft Teams worldwide as of late November 2019, and that is a number of people using this tool. It's a huge success for Microsoft in general, but when you look at that from the viewpoint of Office 365 in general, which is the sort of parent ecosystem where Microsoft Teams lives, we're talking about 200 plus million monthly active users. Now, these two numbers aren't necessarily apples to apples. One is daily active usage, the other is monthly. But that being said, there's a huge gap here, which means there's a great opportunity to nip behavior, bad behavior especially, in the bud. So we have, almost 50 years of what we can all relate to is probably some not the best behavior within email, and that's something that we want to try to avoid, especially right now as tensions might be a little bit high across the world with just general politics and how you work with people. But when you get into a work from home and working remotely experience, it changes things a lot. Probably the most relatable one that we can all think of is the mistaken reply all with an email. A lot of these things are just kind of null and void now within the chat and Teams experience. Some of them are not, but we have that background of basically bad etiquette with an email that we can learn from it. And that's essentially why I put together this everyday guide to Microsoft Teams etiquette, actually a while back at this point. It's just really become that much more relevant to us currently because of the situation where so many people find themselves working from essentially a new environment. So I'm going to start with a prologue to this, which is sort of step 0. What is Microsoft Teams to start with? Well, to begin with, it's a whole bunch of things brought into one. Microsoft likes to say it's a single hub for work. You have communication based on persistent chat, which is kind of like the idea of using iMessage on your iPhone or Android Messenger on your Android device, but much more organized. You can have threads, you can have conversations, they can be separated based on topic, and that's really where the big win comes from and why it's so much better in many ways than email. Because if you have separated conversations based on topic, it means that you can actually ignore topics that are not necessarily relevant to you, but that you might need to be called out on and have some input on later on, or you just want to peruse and look at it later. Versus if you were getting, let's say, 2 different emails, one is essentially spam but made it through the spam filter, and another is a really important message from your boss asking you to do something. As far as email is concerned, those are 2 equally important messages coming through. Whereas in Teams, you can immediately ignore anything that's not relevant to you, and that can be at your own personal pleasure, whatever you prefer. And that's a big win and really helps with that whole I get too much email complaint that we see and have seen for years now. The other thing we're going to see is a lot of file collaboration, real-time, live, together, right within Microsoft Teams, especially using the Office apps, but you can also open up pretty much any other file type. The file sharing experience is coming through SharePoint and also OneDrive for Business, which we'll talk a little bit about later. One of the biggest things that new adopters of Teams are really pleasantly surprised with is the meetings aspect. This is bringing in an entire video conferencing solution right into the app. It's not just a chat app, it's also equally a meetings app. And it also doesn't require you to download a plugin if you are sharing a meeting with somebody outside your organization, say with a client, a customer, a partner, something like that. And you don't have to worry about that whole downloading a plugin for your browser to make sure you can even open up the meeting, and then it takes you 15 minutes to get that thing working because you have to get the IT admin to okay the fact that you have to install a plugin. None of that stuff is ever a worry because it just works, which is really fantastic. You also get a lot of third-party apps, so you can actually bring in a lot of the apps that you already use, whether they're Microsoft or not, into the same experience, which is a huge deal. Now, if you're familiar with the Office 365 experience, this is really bringing a whole bunch of different apps together, right? Email is being replaced by chat, Skype chat, and meetings is being replaced with Teams itself. File sharing is coming from OneDrive and SharePoint, and even the community aspect is coming from Yammer, which might be something you're familiar with. The thing that you really have to keep in mind, though, is when you do create a team in Microsoft Teams, it doesn't just come with this chat space. It actually comes with a lot of stuff in the background, and this is something you should really look into and not take lightly. Because you're going to get features that are going to come with this team that you may or may not use, and if you don't use them, that's fine. But if you do want to use certain tools like Planner, which is similar to Trello, sort of a simplified project management tool, you get a plan with your Microsoft team. You also get a place to keep videos internally, even some business intelligence aspects. So make sure to take a look at certain resources similar to like this infographic, but there are others out there that can help you understand. It's really important though, as when you decide to make a team, you kind of have to know what the impact is when you do that. So let's jump into chapter 1. I'm going to run through a number of tips here that are very general to using Microsoft Teams, and then we'll dive into a bunch more specific things relative to different Teams features. First, make sure to download the apps. If you're using Windows or Mac OS, download the desktop apps, and then for your mobile device, whether it's iOS or Android, download them. You're going to get more feature-rich experience, and you're going to have a much better time with it, especially when you do meetings. You can actually hand off meetings from one device to another, which is fantastic if you're on the go. And there are some other features in there, especially notifications. So you'll see notifications have a lot of options, something that you can really tune to exactly what you want. Sometimes seen as a little bit overwhelming, but you're better off taking a little time to figure these out from the start to ensure that you're getting the notifications that you want to see. A couple quick tips with notifications that I think is really good is you have the ability to turn off notifications to certain channels, which is great. So I mentioned earlier you can essentially ignore channels. This is even another level of ignoring channels. It's not about not going to the channel. It's not even hearing from the channel if you do get called out or something pops up. Another thing is you can turn off notifications for a certain conversation. So if you're getting bored or overwhelmed by people responding to something that's really not relevant to you, but it's in a channel that's still relevant, that's something you can turn off. Another big thing is quiet hours. Quiet hours gives you the opportunity to turn off all notifications from Teams on your mobile device outside of work hours on certain days, whatever you choose. So if you work 9 to 5 and you want to have a strong work-life balance, you can turn off notifications from 5 to 9. And then also turn them off on Saturday and Sunday or whatever your weekend happens to be. It is a hugely popular and very successful way to keep your work-life balance actually balanced and to ensure that you're not going to be bothered from work. Jumping into chapter 2, we're going to talk now about conversations. So these are the threaded conversations or posts within a channel in a team. So each team has multiple channels. Those channels are essentially arbitrarily split up based on topic or project or maybe organization. That's completely up to you as to how you set those up. But these conversations have some features to them that you should be aware of. First, make sure to @mention individuals if you want their attention. This is essentially the same thing as putting them in the to field of an email. If you want to get a response from somebody, this is how they're going to know that this is specifically something that they're supposed to respond with. You shouldn't just be using the @channel and @team mention options. If you want it done by somebody or you want somebody to know that they're being expected to do some work, make sure that you include them specifically. A quick tip on that is when you start typing their name, and as long as they're in the team, you'll start seeing their name pop up. You can actually press backspace on Windows or delete on Macintosh, and you can actually remove their last name or any other extraneous information. This is really useful in the situation of guests, because they do append the word guest at the end, and also to any organizations, and there are plenty of them out there, that include, say, the department name or the office location or other things like that appended to the names, because they can get very long, so long in fact they can actually wrap in the conversation. So you can backspace and remove the information that you don't want to see, or just get rid of somebody's last name to be informal with them and be friendly with them so that they see what the kind of conversation is happening. I mentioned just a little bit before about don't @mention a channel or a team unless absolutely necessary. Think of this as spam. This is you sending out to a distribution group to a whole bunch of people if you were using email. A lot of those people may not want it. And this screenshot, for example, is real. This is a user group that happens to have almost 1,000 people in a team. Do all those people actually need to get this notification? If not, maybe don't send it to everybody that way. So just keep that in mind, because one of the major benefits of Teams is being notified less about less important things. And if you start spamming people with @channel and @team messages, you're not really helping anybody's case. Another big deal for me, at least, is subject lines. If you're not aware, at the bottom left of every new conversation window within Teams is a little Format A button. If you click on that, it will give you a whole bunch of formatting options for your text. And the biggest thing in there is the subject line. Well, you would never send an email without a subject, right? In fact, a lot of email apps don't even let you, or they'll remind you and say, hey, you didn't put a subject line in. Well, the same thing in Microsoft Teams applies. You really need to make sure that you include a subject line, because subject lines come out as being larger text, bold, and they're so much easier to read when you're scrolling fast through your history of conversations. If you just have the standard text and you don't add a subject line, it's really, really hard to keep an eye on what's going on and try to find the things that you're looking for. And I realize that the UI doesn't maybe make it super easy to do, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go that distance to make sure that you do it. When you do start or reply to a conversation and you @mention somebody, don't expect an immediate response. The urgency of a conversation within Teams, at least within a channel, to me, is definitely equivalent to an email. So if that's something that if you emailed me and you expected to not hear back from me for a day, 2, 3 days, don't expect it to be faster just because you're in Microsoft Teams, okay? Especially if you're in a channel. So keep that in mind. When you ask somebody to do something, don't think that you're gonna get it back immediately. And if you're the recipient of that, don't think that you have to get up and start sprinting to get that thing done. Just do it the way that you would have done otherwise, because they're essentially the same thing as being requested via email. Another thing is the thumbs up button. We have reactions within Microsoft Teams, and one of those is a thumbs up. That's not there to be equivalent to, liking a photo of your best friend's child on Facebook. This is not a sentimental thing. Frankly, this can be one of the best acknowledgement tools that you have. A lot of times we get a lot of email that comes back with, oh, I don't know, got it, okay, thanks. Those types of emails make up a big proportion of the number of emails that we always complain about having too many of, right? So in this case, just click the thumbs up when you acknowledge that you saw something. It can be reasonably simple and informal, just so that somebody knows that you saw it, or you could actually make it really strict where the entire team is required to acknowledge the message as part of an official sort of acknowledgement process, if that's something that's important to you. Now, jumping into reactions, the other ones can definitely be more for what you need them to be. So the thumbs up might be good for acknowledging a message, but love, laugh, wow, sad, anger should probably be reserved for less formal messages and jokes, but that depends on your organization. Another thing you might see is people asking, what's the difference? Why do they even exist? And I would just say, in a simple response to that, is they're exactly the same reactions that you have on Facebook. So if you use Facebook, you probably have an idea of what they're for and how they're supposed to be used. So kind of run with that as a best practice. Another major thing not to mix up is going to be the start a conversation box with the reply button. It's very, very tempting to click into the start a new conversation box to just reply to a conversation. That is not going to help anybody. Once you start that conversation, which is basically a reply to an existing one, and anybody else responds to that, you have an orphan conversation, and it's really hard to recover from that because you now have two different conversations going on at the same time. This is a really big deal and can be very logistically hard to deal with. So make sure as people go through this, they know what's actually happening to them. That being said, this has actually already been fixed in the mobile experience. You'll see that you have to actually press a button to start a new conversation as opposed to just having an open box to start typing in. So we'll hopefully see something similar to that brought into the desktop experience sometime soon. Another really important aspect of how you use Teams is the ability to invite guests. These are people who don't work in your organization that work or use even not Office 365, someplace else not within your system. And that's important because you can invite somebody with a Gmail address. You can invite somebody with another Office 365 account and bring them into your team and actually work with them right in your experience, which is fantastic. But just make sure that those people that are already in the team know if you've opened up to guests and that there are guests there and who are there, because you don't want people embarrassing themselves by releasing confidential information among an audience that shouldn't otherwise see it. Now, underneath the title and the title of the team and the name of the channel, in the top of the conversations area, you'll actually see a little message that says this team has guests. It's not super obvious, which is why I think it's important to make sure that everybody in the team knows ahead of time. So send out a message or an announcement so they know that that's a thing. Now, when you do want to invite guests, this is a quick tip. You'll note that their names usually come through kind of broken or ugly. And that's generally because the system lists of names for each of the systems don't necessarily talk to each other the right way. You can actually rename people as you add them into your group, which is really fantastic because it cleans things up and you can remove any extraneous information. As far as I know, you can only do this when you add the person, so make sure that you know when you're doing it to update those names then and only then so that they can come through and look clean. Sometimes the names are actually unrecognizable depending on whatever the username was from the email address that was being used originally, so that's important. Now, one of the hidden gems of Microsoft Teams is the ability to send an email to Teams. So you can actually forward an email to Microsoft Teams, any channel that you have in your team, and what it does is it brings the email itself in, it uploads a copy of the email file into the Files tab of that channel, and any attachments will also be uploaded. Fantastic, because now I can actually discuss an email that we received in our email experience and not have to do reply alls back and forth to people for their discussion when we're used to using Microsoft Teams internally. I can take, let's say, that email from, it's a proposal, we put out an RFP, and that organization sent in their proposal. I can now forward that to the channel that's relevant for that discussion. Maybe there's a channel for each of the RFPs or each of the organizations sending in proposals. Maybe there's one channel just for discussing RFPs. But I can send that in, I can clean up the email before I send it, perhaps remove some of the from, sent to information, and now we can have an internal discussion just in that email. All the files that are attached are now available to us just like they would be in any other channel. It's really, really good for using, and it's just something that a lot of people don't realize is there. All you have to do is click the little ellipsis to the right of any channel name and click Get Email Address, and you can now paste that into any email. In fact, you don't even have to be a member of the team to use the email address, which is really good too. And this is just such a great thing for collaboration inside Microsoft Teams, because you can have your debate internally and then only have one response via email back to the person that sent it originally, and you're good to go. Coming soon, and by the time you watch this video, maybe it's out there, they're going to be including an automatic plugin into Outlook where you can actually share to a team. It's effectively going to do the same thing. It's going to forward that email the same way, but the experience for getting it in there is going to be more native and more obvious as to how you do it. You're going to search for a team and then find the channel, click send, you're good to go. And then once you get into Teams, you'll see what the email looks like when it comes in. And from there, you can have those conversations. Another big topic is ownership. Ownership is important. You have a lot of responsibility when you're the owner of a team, because it's not just the team you own. You have the team itself in Teams, you have the SharePoint site, you have the planner plan, you have the stream video portal. All that stuff is really important. This is a session or another ebook on its own, but just beware of membership, some features, whether or not people can respond to messages, whether you're putting in moderation and actually reviewing content before it gets posted and viewed by other people, whether you're going to allow private channels, all the things like that. That brings us to chapter 3. We're going to talk about channels now. There are a number of things to know about channels. The first being that you can rename your channels. So if you have a channel and something changes, maybe you have a rebrand experience or a project name changes, but you want to keep all the information and history within that channel, you can make a name change to that channel. But you have to be wary that that change doesn't actually change the name of the folder within SharePoint where the files are being saved. So if you have any experience with Teams, you probably know that the files are living in SharePoint in the background, and there's a folder in the default documents library that has all the files, each in a folder associated with the channel name. Once you change the name of the channel in Teams, the folder in SharePoint does not change. And you can't actually change it. When you make a change in SharePoint, it will disconnect it from the team, so the Files tab will actually come up with an error. Now, at the time of recording this, Microsoft is working on some enhancements to make this work a little bit better. So the actual outcomes right now are in flux depending on which type of system you're using, whether it's available to the entire world or if you're in a testing state. So I'm not going to state definitively as to what's going to happen to you if you do make this change and try to play with it in the Files tab. I'm just going to say don't try to play with it in the Files tab. Another thing about channel renames, you can actually include emoji. A lot of people really like emoji in their channel names. One thing that I would recommend is make the channel name first, then rename it to put the emoji in. One thing that occurs if you do it the other way around, or if you just create the channel from scratch with the emoji in it, the emoji, which is a Unicode character and should be supported, it will show up in the URL of the SharePoint site and of some of the other aspects of the team support apps. I don't really want to test that or want to put that into a place of hoping that it doesn't break or that it's definitely going to work. So I generally take advantage of the fact that the rename doesn't affect anything but the channel itself in Teams. Another thing about emoji is they have their own alphabetical order. I mean, they're not alphabetical because they're not actually characters. They're just little graphics, but you won't be able to order your team or your channel names with those, so keep that in mind. But they really do help a lot of people keep an eye on or be quick to get to the channels they want to get to. It's almost like a little mini brand, and I see it all the time these days. One of the big takeaways that I think you should really keep in mind when it comes to channels is don't create a channel unless you absolutely have to. You probably don't need as many channels as you think you do. And that's really important because this is not like some file share or even a big SharePoint site where you just create random folders as you need them. You really want to test yourself and convince yourself that you have a reason for that channel. Make sure that the default isn't create the channel whenever I need it. The default is, hold on, tell me what I really need and why I absolutely need to have that channel before you press the create button. I think that's really important. I also think it's important to reserve one channel for fun stuff. That would include memes, GIFs, jokes, basically like a water cooler area. And I think that's critical because basically humans are social beings. No matter how formal your environment is, people are still going to make jokes and want to share information, gossip, that kind of thing. So definitely make sure that you have a place for that, even if it's just a channel called water cooler and that's where people are told that's where you go to do this kind of thing. I think that's super important. On the same or similar matter here, make sure when you're using memes and GIFs that you're matching this up to the culture of your organization. This is really important because I really think that you should just keep memes and GIFs in one place, one channel only, because while memes and GIFs are hilarious, of course, people have really good jokes that they'll drop in or responses. When you have actual work-related conversation going and you drop a GIF in, that GIF can be huge and the text that's actually important can be really small. And of course, once one person puts a GIF in, that starts a GIF war. And you think you're the funniest person in the world, but the next person that sees your GIF comes back with even a funnier GIF because, of course, they're the most funniest person in the world. So you get into this war where you might have one line of something that's important sandwiched between 25 GIFs and memes, which is completely counterproductive to getting anything done. So make sure that you actually keep this stuff sort of in its own little quarantine zone. I think that's smart because otherwise it can really make it difficult to find stuff in a practical way. One channel that you're always going to have is the general channel. It'll always be the first one that shows up. You can't rename it, you can't move it, you can't delete it, so make use of it. This is a great space to have as a central location for sharing announcements, for bringing up sort of miscellaneous topics as necessary, as long as they're reasonably related to that team. And one thing about announcements, there's actually a new-ish post type called announcement, and it lets you upload an image, so you can actually have a little graphical call out there. The text is a lot bigger, and it just makes it significantly more prominent within the conversation experience. Now, don't overuse that, because if you do, they all look the same, and you've basically removed the importance of it, but it's a really great way to get a major announcement out there as necessary. But really, one of the big takeaways here is that whole only create channels when you really need them, and kind of keep that in mind. Now, that's normally the end of my section on channels, but private channels are here. So if you don't know what a private channel is basically a location or a channel within a team that has its own subset of permissions. This was the largest user voice request in the history of Microsoft Teams. I think it had twice as many votes as the next most popular request. This is something that a lot of people that came from Slack were kind of expecting, even though functionally it doesn't really work the way that I think they were going to expect it to. But it's important to know how private channels work. First, when you create a private channel, anybody can create a private channel by default. They're also enabled for the entire system by default, so that's important to know. At the team level, you can turn off the ability for members to create private channels or channels in general, which is important to know. But when you create a private channel, all the members of that private channel must already be members of the team. No way around that, at least at this point. Another big thing is that not all team owners will necessarily be private channel owners. That's really important because let's say you have a management channel and the person that owns the team more than likely is not a member of management. The management channel should not be accessible to the team owner. So that's why you can potentially have people who own private channels that are not actually owners of the team itself. So that's important to keep in mind. The team owner can see the name and description of every private channel within their team, which is also important. Even from a level of responsibility or accountability, they should be able to know what people are doing with their team. But they don't have access to the conversations, nor do they have access to the files. Now that brings us to how files work in a private channel. The private channel creates its own SharePoint site that is completely disassociated and not related to the original site that was associated and used for the parent team. If that's confusing, I totally understand. But the reason for that is because any team owner, if they had access to all the private channel stuff, they would also have access to all the files. And if the whole point is that they don't have access to the private channel content, both chat and files, it means that you have to have a separate SharePoint site because the site for the parent team is owned by the team owner. And even if you set up a separate library or folder with custom permissions on it, that owner of that team still has the ability to see anything within that SharePoint site. Okay, so that's really important to know. I have a lot more documentation and some videos on this, so make sure to check the description below for some links on knowing everything you might want to know about how private channels work. Now that brings us to chapter 4. We're going to talk about files now. So the big thing about Microsoft Teams is we're not emailing attachments anymore. We are beyond those days. No more of the sending, budget review .xlsx and then get an amended version back in an email that's _2.xlsx or final _ no, really this time it's the final.xlsx. That is a thing of the past. Now we just have one version of a file, a single source of truth. All you have to do is upload it into the files tab within your team, or you can actually attach it as an attachment to a conversation from when you start a new conversation. It's really powerful because from moving forward, you can just link back to that file every time you want to make reference to it. So let's say every Friday, you need to get everybody in your team to fill out their expense report. You don't have to upload a new copy or anything each Friday. Every time that you want to put a message out there, say, hey, everybody, fill out your expense report and include a link to the file directly there so nobody has to go looking around for it because you're the one that cares, right? Make it as easy as possible on them. So you can see, from this screenshot, you have the ability to share a link to any of the files that are within that team so people can bounce between channels if necessary. Very, very powerful. Every change is logged. You have a version history on all these files, so if you ever have an issue where you want to revert back to an earlier version, totally built in. Fantastic use of your files and making sure that they're going to remain exactly the way that you want them. Another big thing is that Microsoft recently upped the file size limit to 100 gigabytes. Before it was 15 gigabytes, before that it was 10. It's been increasing pretty much dramatically for the last few years. And that's really good because now we can actually support organizations that are doing huge file sizes that maybe are working on major multimedia projects, things like that. So keep that in mind. Now, one thing about Teams is you aren't using metadata necessarily nearly as much as you might if you were working in SharePoint in the past. If you don't know what metadata is, don't worry about it. What Teams does is it organizes the files based on folders. Now, I generally recommend try to keep your folder, subfolder, sub-subfolder structure to 3 folders max. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One is a practical reason. It just keeps people from going insane. Right? If you have 15 levels of folders deep on content, it's really difficult to know where that stuff is. Search may not find it as well as it should. Just do it for the sake of humanity to try to keep people from going crazy because they have to keep clicking through to find the files they wanted to get to. Second, because you're going to be using SharePoint, which is a cloud service. To get to SharePoint, you actually have to, it goes through, a web address essentially. Those web addresses have a character limit. And the more folders you have, the more characters you're using, the more chances there are of you actually hitting that limit. So if you hit that character limit, the file's fine. You can actually burrow down into and find a file anytime, but sometimes those links break even when you share them because the limit gets cut off at the end, or the link gets cut off at the end, and you don't have the ability to do everything that you need to. So try to stick to 3 for your colleague's sake and for the sake of not breaking stuff within the system itself. Another big win here is the ability to sync these files locally on your devices, whether that's a laptop, a desktop computer, even your mobile device. And you can actually see all of your files without having to download all of them. But the ones that are downloaded mean that you can actually use them when you're not connected to the internet. That's a really big deal. If you're going on a flight, you're able to do work, and the next time you connect to the Wi-Fi or to the LTE, any updates that you make will get synced up into the cloud. Great. Now, if you have a situation where somebody else was working on the file while you were, next time you get connected to the internet, it comes back and says there's a conflict. You just go through the conflict resolution. It's not a big deal. It also doesn't happen actually all that often because the other people that would be working on this file probably know that you're traveling or know that you're going to be disconnected from the internet. So you can give them a little heads up beforehand and say, hey, please don't play with this file because I'm going to be working on it offline. And then within 5, 8, whatever hours, I'm going to be syncing up. Please work on it then, and I'll let you know when it's available. You're going to be using OneDrive to make these connections. OneDrive is both the app for keeping files in certain places, but it's also the sync tool. If you ever want to look at the files on your mobile device, it's the OneDrive app. You wouldn't actually use the SharePoint app. You could, I guess, use the Office app. That's possible as well, but just know that the OneDrive experience in this case is talking about syncing. It's not necessarily talking just about file saving within the cloud. Another big thing about files within Teams is the fact that it's in SharePoint. So if you have any experience with SharePoint in the past, whether good or bad, frankly, if you like SharePoint a lot, you can still get all the goodness of SharePoint because all you have to do is click Open in SharePoint from the Files tab in that team. So you have metadata, you have lists, you can create new document libraries, you can create pages, you can do all that you would like because it's a standard team site template within SharePoint. And if you didn't like SharePoint, even better, because Teams is basically a pretty version of SharePoint and a simplified version of SharePoint that lets you do things and pretty much only the things that you really wanted to do. Now, one of those things that somebody who really likes SharePoint may want to do is to use local level permissions for maybe certain files or certain folders. Because you're using SharePoint, you definitely can do that. That doesn't mean that I recommend it. One of the beautiful things about Teams is the fact that you have this one bucket of conversations, files, tasks, videos, and so on, and everybody who has access to it has access to everything, which is great. Now, if you do have the need to go forward and do some things with the permissions aspect at the SharePoint level, you may do so, but just keep in mind that management of that moving forward has become significantly more complex. If you ever leave the organization or leave the group itself, make sure other people know what you did and why you did it. It may actually be smart to put down a little why document, just explaining what it is, why it exists, what you thought the needs were when you did that. Now on to Chapter 5. We're going to talk about private chat. Microsoft refers to this as group chat. I don't really like that term because group is so overused within the Office 365 sphere. And frankly, private chat, I think people know what that means when they hear it. So private chat is when you want to do one-to-one conversations with other people, or one-to-many even. You can have a number of people within a private group chat where you're discussing certain things that are not being retained within the conversations in channels within Teams themselves. So my guidance here is to use chat for high priority questions or just to ping friends. I really think that any sort of conversation that's happening that's work related should stick to the Microsoft team itself, go into the chat so that everybody who sees that team and that channel can do so. So my big thing about private chat is to use this more for ad hoc conversations. I think it's critically important that if you're doing actual work and having conversations that are making decisions or coming through the decision-making process, it really needs to be in the channel within the team that you're working in. That keeps things visible, and it also makes sure that when people join the team, they can see the history of the conversations for their own good. And when people leave the team, they lose access to that. They don't need to see that any longer. Private chat is really good for having one-off conversations with people. Sometimes they're just super high urgency, and sometimes you're just, checking in with your buddy. I also look at this as one of those things where the private chat is either super unimportant stuff, but it's urgent, or it's super not urgent, but it's important. When you want to do pretty much anything else in the middle, that's where you're going to go back to the channel and try to keep things transparent. Now, when you do get a conversation coming in through private chat, this is essentially the opposite of a channel conversation where I said that's equivalent to an email. This generally would be something where the urgency is a lot higher because somebody's pinging you directly and saying, hey, got a question for you. Can you do something for me right now? When you do send a message to somebody, please don't say hi. Actually ask or start with hi, comma, hope you're doing well, and then get into what you actually want. Don't say hi and then wait for them to respond because it's awkward for everybody and nobody actually likes it. So I would recommend not doing that. So that's really where it comes down, where I come down to the ad hoc situation within private chat. Don't make it a place where you're actually doing work. Even for things that are not necessarily work related. Maybe you have a fantasy football league or something and you like conversing about that. Make a team for that. There'll be a history of it. Anybody that joins later can see some of the history, maybe some trash talking here and then. And I think that's important. And kind of pushing onto that thought process, as you are conversing in private chat, keep that member count low. And this is not like some sort of quantifiable concept, but the more people you have in a private chat, the more likely it needs to be in a team someplace and it needs to be retained. So keep that in mind. As you start growing in the population within a private chat, don't just assume that that's always necessary, and kind of convince yourself that as you add more people, that they actually are required to be in a private chat, and that it's not something that could be better off in a team. Related to that, membership matters. I don't know if you've noticed this, but you can actually you can start new conversations with the same people, and it'll actually be different conversations. You can also rename them. Very useful because you can have a topic-based private chat with the same people. And what's important about that is as you add new people, they can actually see the past conversations if you let them. So make sure as you're adding people to note whether or not you want them to see chat history for a certain number of days, or not see chat history at all. That's useful for maybe you were having some confidential conversations with 2 other people and you want to add a third person, but you don't want them to see the confidential information prior. Great, they won't see it. That's super, super useful. Or if you needed to bring, John into the conversation and somebody was making fun of John last week, perhaps you don't let John see that. So that kind of realistic stuff in real life. Another big thing about private chat is the files experience is not SharePoint. You are using OneDrive for Business in this situation. Every user within the team system has a OneDrive for Business. And what's important here is when you upload a file into a private chat, you'll notice that if you want to, you can click this option to see the permissions setup. And these are the permissions options for OneDrive for Business. So once you change the permissions here, only these people will be able to see them. They actually get uploaded directly to your OneDrive. If it doesn't exist already, you'll see a folder get created called Microsoft Teams Chat Files. That's why that exists. Don't play with that if you want people elsewhere to have access to those files when you share them. This is another great reason why you should be using a team to do work in, because if you're sharing files especially, you do not want to be sharing from OneDrive, because if you leave the organization, your account gets deleted eventually, all your files get deleted or transferred, and they no longer exist where they were when you first shared it. So if people depend on those files for whatever reason, they eventually will go bye-bye. So you don't want that to happen. Make sure you use Teams and channels instead. Another thing you'll notice within private chat is people's status is really important. If somebody is in a meeting, you'll see them as red. You can actually set up your own status if you want to, custom, say what you're doing in your status report. If you see red with a line in it, it means they're actually in a do not disturb mode, which is you can manually choose, or anytime that you're presenting in Teams itself and presenting your screen, that will automatically turn up. So leave those people alone if you can. You can always get back to them later if you need to. Another big one is the out of office setting. So in Outlook, you're probably familiar with it being purple, same in Teams. But one setting is called available, comma, out of office. It's an open green circle with a green check mark in it. To me, it looks just like available, but it actually means something very different. It means that you are out of the office, but you happen to be looking at Teams, so somebody could see that and totally mistake it and think that you're available and that you're working. So one, share the information that the green circle with the green check in it means that you're still out of office. And the other thing about that is if you are using your mobile device, even if you have the app open, it will set you as available out of office. So don't give people a reason to ping you just because you're playing around with the app on your phone. Another quick tip about out of office replies, the out of office reply that you set up in Outlook also displays in Teams. So instead of saying thank you for your email, instead say thank you for your message. Because in this case, you want it to be platform independent. The people on the inside of your organization who might be using Teams a lot more than email will see that and they will see thank you for your email. Doesn't make any sense. It should say thank you for your message these days or thank you for contacting me, something that's a little bit more neutral to the platform so that whoever receives it is going to see something that's relevant to them. And sort of last but not least about private channels, this really shouldn't have to be stated, but it is important that everybody knows it. Do not assume that you have privacy. The IT administrators have access to all the conversations, files, everything like that going on within Teams. This is no different than email, no different than Skype for Business, no different than any other conversation, file, sharing, or communication app that you've been using, whether you knew it or not. But don't think that just because you're only talking to two people in Teams, nobody else knows that that conversation is going on. So that's really important to keep in mind, and I think it's a good takeaway for the private chat experience. Now, day to day, I live in the world of bots. I build a lot of chat bots for my day job, and it's one of the best features that comes with Microsoft Teams is bots and also apps, third-party apps that you can install or add as tabs within a team or within a channel and have direct access to other tools that you're using. So I thought I'd mention a couple bots here, and I'll talk a little bit about apps. First off, I think some of the bots out there are really, really good. Very useful is something like WhoBot. You're able to ask who is somebody in your organization and get some contact card information about them. Poly gives you the opportunity to put out polls within your channel so people can respond to them. You can get a quick idea of how people are thinking. Maybe you want to find out where everybody wants to go to lunch. Really useful. The one that I work on is AtBot, and that is a bot that you can actually train to do various actions using Microsoft Power Automate, the WYSIWYG no-code workflow tool that comes with Office 365. But one thing that it's really good at too is we've added some training on how to use Microsoft Teams from a user level right in AtBot. So if you install AtBot from the Teams store into Teams, you can converse with it in natural language and ask it how to do things related to Microsoft Teams. It'll come back with best practices, links to resources, things like that. The other big thing here is going to be apps. So you could be able to bring everything into that central hub for work, including a lot of third-party apps that are not even Microsoft. So maybe your organization uses Salesforce for the sales or marketing team, or maybe your IT team uses Zendesk for managing tickets, things like that. You can actually add those as tabs within your channels and have a listing of different apps at the top so you can bounce between them without ever leaving Teams. Let's say that you lead a weekly status update meeting with your team. One channel can be just for that meeting, and you can have your files where you have your agendas, your minutes, your backup files, or any sort of information that's relevant. And every morning before that meeting starts, you can add your tabs at the top to match what needs to be reviewed during that meeting. So maybe you have a tab for the agenda, opens up the Word doc that's in the Files tab related to that, relevant to that day's meeting. You can have the minutes from the last meeting so that people can look at it ahead of time. So nobody has to go looking through the Files tab to figure out which files are relevant. Maybe there are 2 or 3 presentations, so you can have 2 or 3 tabs to the PowerPoint slides that would bring up the slide decks for those people to start presenting directly from there, and everybody else can follow along as necessary. So those tabs and those apps are extremely powerful. Probably the most powerful one is the website tab, because you can basically link to any website and bring that in, so you have it directly available to you whenever you have to use it. Chapter 7 brings us to meetings and calls. Again, this is one of the most feature-rich aspects of Microsoft Teams, and one of the things that surprises pleasantly people who I've been working with when it comes to consulting and guiding them on how best to use Microsoft Teams, because it brings in this experience where you can have a video call with somebody directly and not have to worry about what their phone number is or downloading a plugin or doing anything like that. Now, when you're working with your team internally, one of the best ways to set up a meeting is to actually choose to have that meeting within the channel. And that means that the channel will actually retain the meeting appointment. Your calendar will have the meeting on it. The calendar that you see in Microsoft Teams is the same calendar that you see in Outlook. So you can actually schedule all your meetings from Teams instead, and it will automatically add a join option at the bottom of all your meetings. And actually, it's a really good default way for any meeting to happen, right? Because if you don't know whether or not people are going to be in the same location at the same time, you can always jump into the meeting just to make sure without having to scramble 5 minutes late into the meeting to say, oh, here's the link to get into it. So that's really useful. Another thing about meetings, when you have one, each one has a conversation that goes along with it. Now that could be with anybody that you happen to have a meeting with internally, but also with anybody external, whether it's partners, vendors, customers, whoever else you're inviting. You can invite anybody with an email address to a Microsoft Teams meeting. So it's fully robust, able to do whatever you need to do. The conversation is really useful because you can see what people are chatting about in the meeting. And it's really good to chat when other people are talking instead of trying to interrupt, especially because a lot of times the audio will, you'll have sort of an audio fight and it's really awkward. So the conversation can be good when somebody mentions something that you think is valuable, you want to provide a resource or a link to something that can be useful to read later, you can paste it in there without bothering the person presenting, but everybody else can still see it. Now, when you do have these meetings in channels, which can't include external people, but it's kind of nice to show here, the meeting actually pops up and shows you that it's happening. You will have an invite to it, but you may not want to join, or maybe you didn't get an invite to it, but it's still in the channel itself. You can join because you just want to and you can see it. And you can see that there's the option to reply in this screenshot. That's where you can have those conversations. So any conversation that you have in the meeting itself is retained in the channel. So that means that you have that history. You can also do this for recurring meetings. So you can actually see conversations that have happened over the weeks or over the months that you've been having this recurring meeting. Really, really useful and very good for keeping track of things over the long haul. Now, we are in the 21st century, so I strongly recommend to use video, especially if you're working from home. It is a major, major impact on your team morale and even just how you interact with people if they can't see you. Now, yes, you might be working from home and it's really great to wear your pajama pants or whatever. Well, nobody can see your pajama pants. Put on a button-up shirt, put on a blouse, look presentable in the video, show that you're attentive, that you're actually paying attention, that you're taking part, and people really appreciate that. I think that's super important, and I think there's not really an excuse any longer for us to not be using video unless the internet, for whatever reason, your bandwidth can't support it. On the other side of that, though, is if you're not speaking, please put yourself on mute. This is a big deal because you're the only person that can't hear what's coming through your microphone to everybody else within the meeting. So make sure to put yourself on mute and only unmute yourself when you really want to talk or you have something to add. Of course, you can put yourself, take off mute if you're waiting to get in and jump in to say something. That's perfectly fine. But especially, if you're working from home and you have your dog is whining in the background because it needs to go out to the bathroom, or your kids are running around playing, nobody really needs to hear that, and it's generally unprofessional. Maybe you work in a co-working space and there's just a lot going on in the background because you can never predict what's going on, or there's some construction nearby you. That mute button is your best friend. You also have the ability to mute other people if you need to, so keep that in mind. Now, Teams also has the ability to share your screen, which is amazing. I do not know how IT support people were able to do their jobs before the concept of screen sharing. Now, screen sharing is not new. This was something that came out with Skype. It was with Link. It was a bunch of other tools that have been around for probably more than a decade. But when you do share your screen, a lot of people are sharing web pages. Web pages are small. Even if they're made for mobile and they're kind of bigger these days, that doesn't necessarily mean that the recipient who's seeing the shared screen is able to see what's being shared. So, quick tip, make sure to zoom in on all websites. And the beauty is that most of them are responsive these days, so when you zoom in, they still look really good. Just keep in mind that on all Windows machines, Control+, actually just Control equals. You don't have to press Control Shift to get the plus sign, but that's what the intention is, the plus minus. And Control minus will zoom out. If you're on a Mac, it's Command plus, Command minus. So just keep that in mind, and you will have significantly better meetings. And a couple small best practices or life hacks here will make everybody a lot happier. And frankly, they won't even know that they're happy because they'll just know that they're not annoyed by all the other meetings where they have not seen those types of experiences. Now, to wrap things up, we talked a lot about a bunch of different best practices, lessons learned that I've had, tips and tricks, and of course, this is all just one man's opinion. You can do whatever you want. Take these ideas, run with them, throw some of them out, modify them, customize them to your organization. Whatever makes the most sense to you is the right way to do it. But we just have this opportunity now to sort of build that nirvana that we've really always wanted, but never could have because email has just been so pervasive now for 50, 60 years. And we've been stuck doing the same thing. People just keep up with those bad business practices or the bad etiquette. And now we have this opportunity. It's a new paradigm. It's a new application. People can walk in thinking this is different. Take advantage of the human nature in that situation and say, yes, this is different. We want to follow these rules and this is how we're going to do it. So if you can get a little piece out of that, and nip this in the bud and nip the bad etiquette practices in the bud because this is new to people. This is a great opportunity for your organization to walk away thinking that they've gotten not just a better experience in the UI and how all the conversations and collaborations work, but also in how people actually perform and act within it. And I think that's super important. This is also a really good opportunity for using the ebook that I've put together and sort of make it as an initial compact, okay, as an agreement, almost like a governance type of thing. And you can add it right in your channel as a tab, let's say in the general channel, and you can call it, Teams Etiquette or Compact, whatever you want. And this is an example of using that website tab where you can just load a website and have it always there. People can open it up, they can scroll through. Oh, that's right, we agreed that we're always going to use a subject line. And hey, take that, make your own version of it. Brand it the way that you want to, use similar content, provide me a little bit of credit, and you'll have something that you can use internally, whether it's PDF, Word doc, web page that you happen to build yourself. And I think that's a fantastic way to move forward, getting the most out of some of these recommendations. Now, one of the most popular things that I generally get people asking me for is some resources that I think are the best for moving into Microsoft Teams and then making the most of them. First, you might want these slides. These are useful slides. You can actually use them yourself. You can download them from my website and you can brand them however you want to make them and present internally in your organization. Whether you work for the IT department or you're in change management or you're just a team owner and you're just ready to, you're sick of slapping people's wrists because they're acting not the way that you think that they should. So go ahead and get these slides from the website here. You can also get the ebook. There are two different versions. One of them is for the commercial customers and another one is for government customers. Specifically, that means that the experience is commercial, as in if you have a license, it's like an E1, E3, E5. Also, education licenses have the same experiences. Government does not necessarily mean that you just work for government, but you also have the license that is government. And if all of this means nothing to you, that's perfectly fine. Just ask your IT person. But a lot of the government experiences are actually still waiting on some of the features that I spoke about today. They won't be coming for a while. So you do want to know that that's the case. There are two different versions of this book. I have a link to both of them, the Gov one and the non-Gov one. I guess I'll put it that way. And that's really important. Another big one is a resources list that I have of people to follow, websites to look at, how to keep up to date with changes that happen in Microsoft Teams because they happen all the time. Another one is if you're interested in governance. Some colleagues of mine in the field have put together a really great governance guide that you can use as some bigger picture rules and guidance on how to use Teams on top of the etiquette foundation that I provided today. If you want to keep up with all the changes in O365 in a general sense, you want to check out my infographic that has a listing of all of the resources per app within Office 365, and there are a lot of apps. If you want to show off Teams without having to get people into it directly to start, there's a great interactive demo. I wish Microsoft had this interactive demo for every app that they put out there. It's really, really good. If there are features that you want to include into Teams, maybe you're a former Slack user and you're waiting for some features to come in that you've really wanted, make sure to check out User Voice. That's where you would go in, submit, and then you can vote on other ones, and the higher they get voted up, the more likely they are to be worked. The private channels example I gave earlier, that was something that was on User Voice, and that was worked on because of the popularity from User Voice. And last but not least, the Teams blog. You do want to follow that and make sure to keep up to date as to when things come out. When it comes to feature updates, you're generally going to see major features coming around this time of the SharePoint conference, which is usually every May. And then you'll also see a lot of stuff coming out around Microsoft Ignite, which is usually in the fall, kind of bounces around between September, October, November, depending on the year. So I think those are really important and things for you to keep track of. And I also want to give a special thanks to Chris Webb, who is a peer of mine who works I think he's in Texas, and he does a lot of Teams work. If you ever go to the Microsoft tech community, he's one who's almost always responding to things, helping people out. He provided a peer review of this original document, and I really couldn't have done this without him. And then another is Antonio Matic, who works for Microsoft itself. He's a consultant on the government side. He helped me work on the government edition of the ebook as well. The two of them have been really, really great to work with, and I've really appreciated their feedback, support, and commentary along the way to keep these updates. And I also want to thank my employer, AtBot, for sponsoring just the ability for me to put this product together, and also AvePoint. AvePoint is an organization that does backup recovery, migrations, things like that, and they were able to put together the actual physical version of the book, which is what this is right here. And also hosting this and putting together all the graphics and things like that. If you ever see AvePoint at a conference, make sure to stop by their booth. They always have great raffles, things like that, but they usually have physical copies of the Teams Etiquette Guide that you can take with you and use and have available as you need it. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch today. Make sure to like and subscribe, and please share this out if you think this is useful, especially to other organizations that are currently sort of running at full speed with the whole work from home idea that may not have been otherwise built in. And feel free to comment, ask questions below. And one caveat I will say, things change all the time, and I really, really, really appreciate your understanding if anything that I said today is no longer relevant, because things can change, and it means that features can sometimes go away or come out and be available to fix those things up. So thank you very much, and great luck making the most of your Teams experience.